One of the simple things we can say is that most of the land that's suitable for agriculture around the world is already in agriculture. We find most of the cultivated lands of the world in places where we have the best soils and the best climates, basically. So the Midwestern US with the really good prairie soils, Western Europe going into Ukraine. There's a lot of the river basins of India and China, parts of Africa, Latin America. Essentially, places where we have good soils, good climate, good water resources, we find agriculture. I mean, there are no easy answers for it, but we know some of the problems are in the tropics. There's huge amount of agricultural expansion, there's deforestation. So stopping that is probably initial part of the solution, but at the same time, if you do that, we have to produce food elsewhere. So increasing the productivity of existing agricultural lands is a solution that is necessary. There are lots of people who would argue that that's not necessary, but if you want to produce more food, that's the only solution left. But we also think we can do that more smartly. So in places like Africa and Latin America, they're not applying a lot of fertilizer and water today. Those places could benefit hugely by just targeted applications of small amounts of nutrients, small amount of water. So in Asia definitely benefited from the Green Revolution, but it didn't really happen in Africa. Like more irrigation infrastructure, giving them access to the markets, giving them incentives to produce. Currently, a lot of African farmers cannot compete with North American farmers, so getting rid of subsidies, access to fertilizer at cheaper rates, all the things that we did in the West to help our farmers, we can do that in Africa as well. What we've argued is not increasing fertilizer globally. So we are talking about reducing fertilizer use in some places and increasing it in other places. So places like Africa and Latin America, where currently there are not a lot of inputs into the agricultural system, they are greatly by adding just a little bit of nutrients and water. At the same time, in the developed parts of the world, places where we have an over-intensification problem, there we believe that we can reduce nutrient use and water use greatly with very little consequences for yields, because it's the issue of diminishing returns to inputs as a global total essentially balances out. I mean, I think they all have a role to play, but we have to look at multi-pronged solutions. We can't just pick one favorite solution and hope that that one favorite solution will completely change the global food system. So my research has shown that organic systems do very well in perennial systems or leguminous systems in rain-fed conditions, but maybe for cereals it's not so good. With urban agriculture, we think that urban agriculture can play a role in providing fresh food, fresh nutritious diets with low travel costs, low carbon emissions. But my own research has shown that it cannot fulfill all of urban communities' caloric need. I feel like it has to be a mixed system. We are not going to get away from conventional agriculture, but we can reduce some of the global environmental impacts of conventional agriculture. Ultimately, I feel like agriculture has to be rewarded based on its performance and not based on ideologies. So we have to produce more food. We have to do it with low environmental costs. We have to make sure that the people who produce food can earn a livelihood from that. Beyond that, whatever system can achieve that, it should be part of the solution. It's a very tricky question. Sometimes I think when I'm buying food that comes from India, I'm supporting a developing country farmer in India. It's not. Why is that such a bad thing? The whole local food movement started because of the food miles issue. People believing the huge carbon emissions associated with that. There was a climate footprint, but lots of studies have shown since then that carbon footprint associated with transportation of food is minimal compared to the production of food. The amount of energy that goes into producing food is maybe 4 to 5 times greater than the amount of energy in transporting the food. We can transport food pretty efficiently around the planet. Okay? So if you really want to save energy costs of agriculture, we should be focusing on the production practices, not on the transportation. The most obvious one is the shift of diets. If you eat grains directly, you get a certain amount of calories, but if you take those grains and feed it to cattle and eat the cattle, there's a huge loss of efficiency. Typically, when you go down trophy chains, you higher up the trophy chain, only about 10% of the energy gets passed. Shifting from a meat-intensive diet to a vegetarian diet, or even simply eating less meat than what you're currently doing, can release a huge amount of calories into the planet. This is very poorly quantified, but the rough estimates are that roughly a third of the food around the world is wasted. There's one study that said that 50% in the US is wasted, so it can be enormous. So essentially most of the food in the developing countries are wasted before it gets to the consumer. In the Western world, most of the waste happens post-consumer in our refrigerators, where we don't have enough time to cook anymore. It sits in our refrigerator and rots, or dinner plate at restaurants, for example. I mean, I think we can't leave it completely to the consumer. I completely believe that. I mean, I think there are solutions that need to happen at multiple levels. It needs to happen at the consumer level through better education, awareness, and so on. But we need to also have solutions that occur at the policy level, the level of working with agro-businesses and changing their practices, changing markets, pricing structures, and so on. 65 to 75% of the world yields are continuing to improve, which is good news. But the bad news is that 25 to 35% of the world's lands yields are starting to stagnate. So some people talk about what we call total factor productivity. It's like how much output are you getting for the total amount of input we put in. And so we need to start looking at how that's been changing as well. So if total factor productivity has been going down, that is, we're putting more input but getting less output, that means maybe we're hitting the threshold of some kind of genetic ceiling or something. But if the outputs are going down but inputs are also going down, then we know that it's just purely because people are changing their incentives. Again, people have two different views on it. Some people say we will have new technologies within 5 years, new seeds that can produce high yields, and then there are others who say, well, this is what's happened in the last 5 years, so that's worrisome. There's been less investment in R&D as well in agriculture. Before the Green Revolution, there was a huge amount of money being put into agricultural research, and that's gone down in recent years. Yeah, presumably it shifted elsewhere, but since the food crisis of 2008, I think there's now increasing emphasis on putting money back into that. My sense is that we're going to see more of those in the future, purely because the agricultural system is under tremendous pressure now. There's pressures from multiple things going on at the same time. There's pressure on the agricultural system from increasing meat consumption, from increasing demand for biofuels. At the same time, we are seeing extreme weather events occurring concurrently in different places on the planet. So in 2008, when we had the food crisis, there was I think floods in Argentina, and there were droughts in Australia at the same time as big fires in Russia. So a lot of these extreme weather events seem to be occurring more frequently and much more concurrently in different parts of the world. At the same time, we have more speculation in the food market. We have lower food stocks than ever before, and so there's increasing pressure from multiple dimensions on the food system. So I suspect that in the future we'll have a hard time keeping food prices stable. There is I may say, contentious debate in the agricultural community about people who have their own favorite solutions, whether it's organic agriculture or GM, or sticking with conventional agriculture and providing more subsidies, or people who think we should do more urban or local agriculture. There needs to be a better dialogue, I think a better kind of analytical framework that's set up to evaluate agriculture for its performance. If agriculture has to produce more food, reduce its environmental footprint, and provide livelihoods for farmers, how do we measure if agriculture is doing it? What kind of metric, or maybe think of a sustainability metric for agriculture that says that it's achieving these things? How do we measure it, and how can we compare it between different systems? Can we set up experiments to see how they play out both on the field but in larger communities and so on? The other big question, I think, that's very complex is understanding the kind of the global linked nature of our agricultural system. We live in a world where markets are connected. The global price of food influences people everywhere. How do shocks in one place of the planet influence other places? Trying to understand this interlinked nature is also going to be interesting and challenging.